It was a day like any other, or so I thought. Ilda and I were settled on the couch, watching one of her favorite black and white movies. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the room. Ilda had fallen asleep, her gentle snores blending with the faint dialogue from the TV. I was half watching the screen, lost in the timeless black and white world, when a sudden knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. The knock was sharp and insistent, echoing through the quiet house. Ilda didn't stir, so I reluctantly got up to answer it. As I approached the door, a strange feeling crept over me, a mix of curiosity and unease. I peeked through the small window beside the door and saw a man standing at the gate. He was tall and imposing, dressed entirely in black. His skin was dark, almost blending into the shadows that surrounded him. He had a stern expression, and his eyes seemed to pierce through the dim light. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about him made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside and opened the door slightly. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling a bit. The man looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Is Ilda here?" he asked in a deep, almost menacing voice. I nodded slowly. "Yes, she's here." "Who are you?" He didn't answer my question. Instead, he leaned in slightly and said, "Ilda needs to come with me." "Where is she?" I glanced back into the house, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "I'll go get her," I mumbled, closing the door quickly before hurrying back to the living room. Ilda was still asleep, oblivious to the strange visitor at her door. "Ilda," I whispered, shaking her gently. "There's someone at the door asking for you." She stirred, opening her eyes groggily. "Who is it, dear?" "I don't know." He didn't say. "He just asked for you." Ilda frowned, but she got up slowly and followed me to the door. When we got there, I opened it again, expecting to see the man still standing outside. But he was gone. The gate was closed, and there was no sign of him anywhere. "He was just here," I said, feeling a wave of confusion and fear wash over me. Ilda looked around, then back at me with a puzzled expression. "Maybe you were dreaming, dear. There's no one here." I knew what I had seen, and the man's words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. "He said you needed to go with him," I insisted. Ilda shook her head, looking concerned. "It must have been a dream. Come on, let's go back inside." I wanted to believe her, but something about the man's presence lingered in my mind. As we returned to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary visitor. It was as if a shadow had passed through Ilda's house, leaving a trail of unease in its wake. The next few days passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the memory of that strange man. His piercing eyes and unsettling presence lingered in my thoughts, casting a shadow over my daily routine. Ilda seemed to have forgotten about the incident, dismissing it as a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. 3 days after the encounter, I arrived at Ilda's house after school as usual. The house felt different that day, quieter if that was even possible. I called out to Ilda as I stepped inside, but there was no response. Thinking she might be napping again, I headed to the living room, expecting to find her on the couch. But she wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the kitchen, the small study, even the garden out back, but there was no sign of Ilda. Panic started to set in as I raced from room to room, calling her name. The house, which had always felt so familiar and safe, now seemed like a maze of shadows and empty spaces. I ran to the front door, flinging it open and looking out into the street. It was empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as I realized that the man might have come back. Maybe he had taken her when I wasn't there. I slammed the door shut and sprinted to the living room, grabbing the phone to call my mom. As I dialed, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. The phone rang and rang before she finally picked up. "Mom, Ilda's gone," I blurted out, my voice cracking with fear. "What do you mean she's gone?" my mom asked, sounding concerned. "She's not here. I looked everywhere, and she's just gone." My mom tried to calm me down, saying she would call Ilda's children to see if they had taken her somewhere. I hung up and sat on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. A little while later, Ilda's daughter, Maria, arrived. She searched the house herself, calling out for her mother, but it was no use. Ilda was nowhere to be found. When Maria asked me what happened, I told her about the man at the door a few days earlier. He said she needed to go with him. I repeated, my voice trembling. And then he just disappeared. Maria gave me a sympathetic look but didn't seem convinced. It must have been a bad dream, she said softly. There's no way someone just came and took her. I wanted to argue, to make her understand that it wasn't a dream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. As the evening wore on, the police were called, and a search was initiated. They questioned me about the man, but without any tangible evidence, it felt like they didn't take me seriously. Everyone seemed to believe that Ilda had wandered off or that there was some logical explanation for her disappearance. But deep down, I knew the truth. The man in black had come for her, just as he said he would. And now she was gone, leaving behind an empty house filled with shadows and unanswered questions. The days following Ilda's disappearance were a blur of anxiety and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in black and the ominous words he had spoken. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his intense gaze and heard his deep, chilling voice asking for Ilda. The familiar comfort of her home was replaced by a gnawing fear that something terrible had happened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Ilda's family and the police continued their search, but there were no leads, no signs of where she might have gone. I started having trouble sleeping, haunted by nightmares that blurred the line between reality and imagination. I kept replaying that fateful evening in my mind, wondering if there was something I missed, some clue that could explain her sudden disappearance. Then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the news came. It was a gray, overcast day when I found out. My mom picked me up from school, her face pale and eyes red from crying. She held my hand tightly, and I knew something was wrong. "Ilda's gone, honey," she said softly, her voice breaking. "They found her this morning." The world seemed to tilt and spin around me. My legs felt weak, and I clung to my mom for support. The details were blurry, but Ilda had been found in a nearby forest, her body cold and lifeless. The cause of death was unclear, but the circumstances were enough to send shivers down my spine. The man in black had said she needed to go, and now she was gone forever. The days that followed were filled with mourning and unanswered questions. Ilda's funeral was a somber affair. Her family and friends gathered to say their goodbyes. I stood by my mom's side, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Ilda had been like a grandmother to me, and now she was gone, taken by a mysterious force I couldn't understand. In the days leading up to her death, there had been strange occurrences that I only now began to piece together. The creaking floorboards at night, the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and the flickering lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. At the time, I had dismissed them as my imagination running wild, but now they felt like ominous signs, warnings that I had failed to heed. One evening, just before her disappearance, Ilda had mentioned feeling watched, a sensation she couldn't quite explain. She had laughed it off, saying it was probably just old age making her paranoid. But now I wondered if she had sensed something I hadn't, some presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim her. As I stood by her grave, the memory of the man's words echoed in my mind. "Ilda needs to go." The weight of those words pressed down on me, filling me with a fear I couldn't escape. The man in black had come for Ilda, and now she was gone, leaving me with a haunting question. Who or what had he been, and why had he chosen her? The impact of Ilda's death was profound, leaving a void in my life that no one else could fill. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something beyond my understanding, something that defied logic and explanation. The fear and unease lingered, a constant reminder that the world was a darker, more mysterious place than I had ever imagined. When I was around 8 years old, my afternoons were always the same. After school, I would walk a few blocks to my neighbor Ilda's house. Ilda was an elderly woman who lived alone in a quaint, yet slightly dilapidated house at the end of our street. My mom worked long hours, so Ilda would watch over me until she got off work. It was a routine I had grown accustomed to, one that felt safe and comforting in its familiarity. Ilda's house always had a unique smell, a mixture of old wood, lavender, and something else I could never quite identify. The walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper, and the creaky wooden floors echoed with each step. There was a certain heaviness in the air, an atmosphere that felt thick with memories and secrets. Despite the slight eeriness, I felt a sense of belonging there. Ilda's home was a place where time seemed to slow down. The living room, where we spent most of our time, was cluttered with antique furniture and knickknacks. A large, dusty bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with old books and family photos. Ilda would often tell me stories about the people in those pictures, her late husband, her children, and even some distant relatives whose faces looked ghostly in the sepia-toned photos. Our afternoons together were simple but enjoyable. We would settle on her worn-out floral couch and watch TV. Ilda loved old black-and-white movies and classic TV shows. She would laugh and comment on the actors, sharing tidbits of trivia that fascinated me. Sometimes, she would drift off to sleep, her soft snores blending with the background noise of the television. I would sit quietly beside her, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease in the dimly lit room. Ilda and I had a bond that went beyond mere companionship. She was like a grandmother to me, always offering wisdom and warmth. Her stories and gentle presence made her house feel like a second home, even with its peculiarities. Little did I know, those peculiarities were just the beginning of an experience that would haunt me for years to come. Years have passed since that dreadful time, but the memory of the mysterious man and Ilda's untimely death still haunts me. I've grown older, but the fear and confusion of that period have never really left me. Every so often, I find myself drifting back to that fateful day, the man's voice echoing in my mind. "Where is Ilda? She needs to go." The chilling memory of his presence is as vivid as ever. His piercing eyes, his imposing figure dressed all in black, and the way he seemed to know exactly who Ilda was. It all still sends shivers down my spine. I can recall every detail with unsettling clarity, as if it happened only yesterday. Whenever I think about it, a sense of dread creeps over me, making my heart race and my skin crawl. I've tried to rationalize the encounter, to find some logical explanation for what happened. Maybe the man was a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of a child's overactive mind. Perhaps Ilda's death was just a tragic coincidence, and the strange occurrences in her house were nothing more than the creaks and groans of an old building. But deep down, I know that's not the case. The memory of that man and his ominous words is too real, too specific to be merely a product of my imagination. Over the years, I've searched for answers, delving into stories of the supernatural and the unexplained. I've read about encounters with shadowy figures, harbingers of death who come to collect souls. None of the accounts I found match exactly what I experienced, but they all reinforce the same terrifying possibility, that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding, forces that can reach out and alter our lives in ways we can't control. Ilda's death left a void in my heart, but it also left me with a burden of fear and uncertainty. Who was that man? Why did he come for her? Was he some kind of grim reaper, a messenger of death, or something else entirely? These questions have no easy answers, and they plague me to this day. Every now and then, I dream of that house, of the creaking floors and the dimly lit rooms. In my dreams, I see the man in black standing at the gate, waiting. His eyes bore into mine, and I feel the same fear I felt as a child. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. "Where is Ilda? She needs to go." These haunting memories have shaped who I am, leaving me wary of the unknown and skeptical of the comforting explanations people offer for the inexplicable. Ilda's death remains a mystery, and the man in black remains an enigma. I may never know who or what he was, but I can't escape the lingering fear that one day, he might return, not for Ilda, but for someone else. As I sit here, reflecting on that dark chapter of my life, I realize that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The world is full of shadows and secrets, and sometimes, all we can do is accept that there are things beyond our understanding. Ilda's memory lives on, a reminder of the fragility of life and the terrifying unknown that lurks just beyond the veil of the ordinary.